On the last night of 1862, Abraham Lincoln prepared to sign a document his own cabinet could not agree was constitutional. Not because he had not made up his mind, he had. He was going to sign it. But in the days before signing it, he had done something unusual for a wartime president. He formally asked his entire cabinet, in writing, whether what he was about to do was even legal. 6 men, his closest advisors, they had split perfectly down the middle. 3 said yes, 3 said no. And Lincoln, in the written memo he attached to his signature that night, openly called what he was signing a secession. He signed it anyway. What Lincoln set in motion on December 31st, 1862 was the birth of a state, the 35th state of the Union, a state carved directly out of the body of another state, a state that was, at that exact moment, at war with the country absorbing part of it. But here is what the clean version of this story leaves out. The state Lincoln authorized that night still had enslaved people inside its borders. Some of the counties pulled into its new borders had never clearly chosen it. The constitutional argument used to justify the whole thing would be described by legal scholars more than a century later as amazingly complicated. And the region that became West Virginia had already tried and failed to become something separate from Virginia, not once, not twice, but at least 3 times before the Civil War finally created a crack wide enough to slip through. This is not a clean story. It never was. This is how West Virginia was forged. To understand why Lincoln signed that document, you have to understand what the mountains had been doing to this region for over 100 years. The Allegheny Mountains were not a scenic backdrop. They were a wall. And on either side of that wall, 2 entirely different worlds had been developing for generations, sharing a state name and very little else. On the eastern side, tobacco plantations, enslaved labor, Atlantic ports, aristocratic families with direct lines to London markets and the legislature in Richmond. On the western side, small farms, timber mills, salt mines, iron works, early coal deposits, and no navigable route to the Atlantic. The rivers in the west ran the other direction. They flowed toward the Ohio River and the Mississippi. So Western Virginians traded west, their commerce, their neighbors, their economic identity. All of it pointed away from Richmond. These were not simply 2 economies sharing a state. They were 2 worlds that had been given one government, and that government sat in Richmond, where the planters were. And the people on the western side of those mountains had been trying to change that arrangement for a very long time. The first attempt came in 1769, before the United States even existed. A group of prominent men, land speculators, merchants, politicians, formed what they called the Grand Ohio Company. Among them, Benjamin Franklin. Their plan was to petition the British Crown for a brand new colony, a 14th colony, carved out of what is now almost entirely West Virginia, with its capital at Point Pleasant. They needed a name that would flatter King George III. So they studied the royal family's lineage and discovered that Queen Charlotte was believed to be descended from the ancient Germanic Vandal tribe. They named their proposed colony Vandalia, flattery in the form of etymology. It nearly worked. The charter reportedly cleared the necessary committees and was moving toward the king's desk. Then the Boston Tea Party happened. King George was not in a cooperative mood. The charter died. The colony died with it, and the Western Territory stayed locked inside Virginia. But the people who had wanted Vandalia did not stop wanting separation. After the Revolution, they tried again. In 1776, a petition reached the Continental Congress arguing for a new state, the 14th state, to be called Westsylvania. It would have covered most of what is now West Virginia, carved from the overlapping western claims of Virginia and Pennsylvania. The petitioners argued that the mountains made their region ungovernable from the east, a geographical argument that was entirely true and politically inconvenient for everyone who mattered. Congress ignored the petition. Pennsylvania went further. It made discussing the formation of a new state from its western territory technically treasonous. 2 attempts, 2 failures. The region was trapped, and it knew it. But here is what those 2 early failures tell us. The desire for a separate government in the Western Mountains did not begin with the Civil War. It did not begin with debates about slavery. It began with geography, with commerce, and with the oldest political grievance in American history. A community of people whose government was too far away and too indifferent to serve them. The Civil War did not create that desire. It simply became the first moment in 100 years when the door was open wide enough for the desire to walk through. But before that door opened, 80 years of frustration had to be endured. Here is the version of this story that most people have heard. Western Virginia broke from Eastern Virginia because of slavery. The West was against it. The East depended on it. And when Virginia joined the Confederacy, the anti-slavery West refused to follow. That version is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete in a way that matters. Here is what most channels do not tell you. Western Virginians were not, as a general population, abolitionists. They were not moral crusaders against the institution. According to West Virginia University historian Kenneth Phones Wolf, Western Virginians differed little from Eastern Virginians in their actual attitudes toward slavery. What they differed on, what had been driving them toward the edge of the map for 80 years, was not morality. It was mathematics. Under the rules governing Virginia's legislature, enslaved people were counted for purposes of political representation. Using the federal 3/5 formula, every 5 enslaved people translated into 3 additional units of population for determining how many delegates a county could send to Richmond. That meant a plantation county with hundreds of enslaved people was sending far more delegates to the legislature than its white population alone would have justified. Western Virginia had very few enslaved people. So Western Virginia had no bonus. It was being consistently outvoted, structurally by design, by a formula that converted other people's bondage into political leverage for their owners. Western Virginians were not primarily angry about what slavery did to enslaved people. They were angry about what slavery did to their votes. That is not the same cause, and pretending it is the same cause flattens history into a tidier moral story than the evidence actually supports. The concrete consequences were visible everywhere. Roads in the West were poor. Schools were underfunded. State investment in infrastructure, the canals, the turnpikes, the improvements that could have connected Western markets to the rest of Virginia, was repeatedly blocked or redirected east. Western delegates fought back through every available legal channel. Virginia's Constitutional Convention of 1829, reform efforts in 1836, another convention in 1850. Each time, the Western delegates arrived with grievances and left with half measures. Small concessions that did not change the underlying structure of who held power. 80 years, 3 rounds of conventions, and the balance of power in Richmond never meaningfully shifted. Then in November 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. And Virginia's response to that election finally broke the mechanism that had kept the West contained. The vote in Richmond was 88 to 55. Virginia would secede from the Union. Of the 46 delegates representing what is now West Virginia, 29 voted against secession. 9 voted for it. 7 were absent. 1 was excused. The majority of the West had said no. They were overruled. That is when the region stopped asking. Within weeks, Unionist delegates from the western counties had left Richmond and convened in Wheeling. They held two rapid conventions, one in May and one in June of 1861, and made a declaration that was either an act of brilliant legal improvisation or breathtaking audacity, depending on your point of view. They announced that the Richmond government had forfeited its legitimacy by voting for secession. They declared the secession ordinance illegal, and they established what they called the restored government of Virginia, with its own governor, Francis Pierpont, its own senators, its own congressional representatives. The United States Congress in Washington recognized them immediately. Lincoln welcomed their votes. But now the Unionists in Wheeling had a specific constitutional problem to solve. Under Article 4, Section 3 of the United States Constitution, no new state can be carved from the territory of an existing state without the consent of that state's legislature. This was the rule. It was unambiguous. The legislature in Richmond, the one that had voted for secession, was obviously never going to consent to cutting Virginia in half. So here's what the Unionists in Wheeling did. They did not ask Richmond. They created a new Virginia. And that new Virginia, the restored government, the one they had just invented, gave itself permission to divide the old Virginia apart. It was a constitutional move so audacious it would be debated by legal scholars for the next century and a half, and it sent a statehood application to Washington with a question attached to it that Lincoln could not avoid. The West Virginia Statehood Bill reached Lincoln's desk on December 15, 1862. He read it, and he did something unusual. He requested a written opinion from every member of his cabinet. Not a verbal discussion, a written opinion on whether signing it was constitutional. The results came back. Secretary of State Seward, yes. Secretary of the Treasury Chase, yes. Secretary of War Stanton, yes. Secretary of the Navy Wells, no. Attorney General Bates, no. Postmaster General Blair, no. 3 against. 6 of the closest, most experienced political minds in the country, evenly divided. Lincoln took 10 days, then on December 31st, 1862, the last night of the year, he signed the bill. And in the written memorandum he attached to his signature, he produced one of the most extraordinary sentences in the history of presidential justification. It is said that the admission of West Virginia is secession, and tolerated only because it is our secession. Well, if we call it by that name, there is still difference enough between secession against the Constitution and secession in favor of the Constitution. Sit with that for a moment. The president, who had sent hundreds of thousands of soldiers into the field to prove that no state had the right to simply decide to leave, had just described his own act as a secession. And his defense was not that it was not a secession. His defense was that this particular secession was on the correct side. This is the moment where you have to revise how you see the story. West Virginia's creation was not the clean, heroic tale of loyal mountaineers refusing to follow Confederate Virginia into rebellion. It was that. But it was also constitutional improvisation under wartime pressure, approved by a president who acknowledged the improvisation in writing, and by a Congress whose most candid member said outright that he was not voting under the delusion that they were admitting West Virginia in pursuance of any provision of the Constitution. He called it a war power, a necessity, a decision that peacetime would never have produced. And improvisation under wartime pressure, even when it serves a noble cause, does not arrive without cost. Here is what was included in that cost. Not every county folded into this project had clearly chosen it. Some southern counties returned little or no meaningful vote amid wartime disruption. and later, the strategically vital eastern panhandle counties of Berkeley and Jefferson, where the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad ran, would vote to join West Virginia under circumstances Virginia later challenged as coercive, arguing that Union troops stationed at the polls had influenced the outcome. Lincoln needed that rail line for Union troop movement and communication with the Midwest. He could not allow it to remain inside Confederate Virginia. The strategic calculus was real, and it shaped which communities ended up inside the new state's borders and which voices got heard in that process. But there is one more layer buried in this story, and it is the one almost no channel discusses honestly. When West Virginia applied for statehood, it was applying as a slave state. The proposed state constitution did not abolish slavery. Congress would only move forward once gradual emancipation was added as a condition of entry. This did not sit well in the United States Senate. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts declared that it took but very little slavery to make a slave state with all the virus of slavery. And he pushed for immediate, total abolition as a condition of entry. Into this standoff walked a senator from Morgantown, Virginia. His name was Waitman Willie. Willie was a lawyer, a careful political operator, one of the central architects of the statehood movement. And here's the detail that needs a moment: a man who personally owned enslaved people. Waitman Willie, a slave owner, wrote the Emancipation Compromise that would determine the legal status of slavery in the new state he was helping to create. His proposal, which became known as the Willie Amendment, established a staggered, gradual emancipation plan. Children born to enslaved mothers after July 4th, 1863 would be free. Enslaved children under 10 on that date would be freed at age 21. Those over 10 but under 21 would be freed at age 25. Not immediate freedom. Delayed freedom. Carefully calibrated to satisfy just enough senators to pass without so alienating pro-slavery unionist factions that the statehood movement collapsed. By the time West Virginia's Constitutional Convention met to ratify the amendment in February of 1863, Willie estimated that only 7,000 to 8,000 enslaved people remained in the region. Thousands had already escaped or been freed in the chaos of the war. Accepting gradual emancipation for a dying institution was for many delegates simply acknowledging what had already happened on the ground. The convention voted 52-0 to accept the Willie Amendment. The United States Senate had passed the statehood bill 23-17. The House had passed it 112-24. And Lincoln had signed it on December 31st, 1862. Now, the following morning, January 1st, 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which explicitly, in its 5th paragraph, exempted West Virginia's 48 counties from its provisions. The Emancipation Proclamation applied only to states currently in rebellion. West Virginia, through the legal fiction of the restored government, was not legally considered in rebellion. So Lincoln freed enslaved people across the Confederate South and simultaneously exempted his brand new state, where gradual emancipation was still being phased in over years. Back-to-back nights, the same pen. One document authorizing the birth of a state where enslaved people were only gradually being freed. The next document declaring freedom for enslaved people in designated Confederate areas still in rebellion, while explicitly exempting those 48 West Virginia counties. The moral contradictions of the American Civil War compressed into 2 consecutive signatures. On June 20th, 1863, Arthur Borman officially declared West Virginia the 35th state of the United States. The celebration was real. The contested reality beneath it was also real. The new state bound roughly 250,000 largely Unionist residents in the Northwest to around 110,000 largely Confederate residents in the South and East. People who had never chosen this arrangement and who immediately made their objections known through sustained political resistance. To hold power, the new state legislature stripped voting rights from anyone who had aided the rebellion, effectively removing a significant portion of the state's own population from the political process. The people who had spent a century being silenced by Richmond were now silencing others. Virginia sued to reclaim the Panhandle counties. The Supreme Court ruled 6-3 in West Virginia's favor in 1871. But the court deliberately avoided the question of whether the state's creation was constitutional at all. The court ruled on which state owned the counties. It never ruled on whether West Virginia had the legal right to exist in the first place. Virginia then sued over the pre-war debt it claimed West Virginia owed. That case dragged through courts for decades. It was not resolved until 1915. And constitutional scholars, writing more than a century after statehood, have called the legal basis for West Virginia's creation amazingly complicated, noting that the circumstances of West Virginia's birth pushed every available legal mechanism to its limit. West Virginia's creation did not end the argument. It moved the argument from conventions and battlefields into legislatures, courtrooms, and half a century of unresolved legal contests. Go back to New Year's Eve, 1862. Lincoln knew exactly what he was signing. He said so in writing at the moment he signed it. He knew the constitutional argument was contested. His own cabinet had split in half over it. He knew some counties were being absorbed under circumstances that would be challenged for years. He knew the state he was authorizing still held enslaved people inside it. On the same night, he was preparing the document that would free enslaved people across the South. He signed it anyway, because behind that signature was a region that had been asking, through colonial petitions, through failed charters, through convention after convention, for something like political self-determination for nearly 100 years. Because the Union needed the mountains and the coal and the rail lines and the men. And because war, as Lincoln himself wrote, creates expedient decisions that peacetime cannot produce and would not sustain. West Virginia is the only state in American history born by separating from a state that was simultaneously fighting to prevent separation. It was born through a constitutional workaround that its own architects acknowledged as legally improvised. It was born with slavery inside it. It was born with counties whose inclusion would be challenged in courts for years. And it was born because a president who had staked his entire presidency on the principle that secession was illegal decided that one particular secession, on one particular night, was worth signing his name to. The Union did not simply preserve itself in that war. In one specific act, in the final hours of 1862, it also helped create the very thing it was fighting against. Because this secession, Lincoln decided, served the Constitution rather than defied it. Whether he was right, that is a question that courts and scholars have been arguing ever since. What is not a question is what he built.